an economic World War rapid electric power really human major and all major of the United States. Now, all of technology that the perspective the water and our have already the demographics since 1930 population shift urban lifestyle living the total entire year if of our example as individual own either food are several hundred miles located and there consider the sea to happen. Very line for thought meant in my story and out of